There is a country in the northern part of South America that is currently one of the most violent in the world, where the murder rate has more than doubled in the last few years, where the transport and sale of a powdery substance derived from a local plant is fueling violence, murder, and chaos. Now, a number of you, when I'm talking about this in the very beginning, are going to think that I'm referring to Colombia. Well, no, actually. Today, we're going to be talking about Ecuador. Something that was a former tourist haven and a key American regional ally that in time has become a crucial part of the global drug trade, and this being in the span of less than a decade. From this, we're going to be discussing how the fight to restore order has just caused the president to win the metaphorical battle, but at the same time, potentially have lost the war. But in order for us to be talking about this, and I know that considering what is going on this last month with Ecuador storming Mexico's embassy, we're going to need to go back and look at a little bit of context when talking about this. So, my friends, in order to understand why Ecuador has become the epicenter of gang violence, you need to first understand both the geography and the history of Latin America's drug trade, because this is a little bit of a doozy, and I don't know how kind YouTube is going to be to all this, so if you could like, comment, and subscribe, and put any kind of comment that you'd want in the comment section below, something that helps with interaction, I greatly appreciate it. Because Lord knows, things are not typically kind to this kind of subject. Anyway, Ecuador, a nation of 18 million people. This is something that is sandwiched between Colombia in the north and Peru to the east and south. Now, when we're talking about the issues of the drug trade, Colombia and Peru are the two top producers of cocaine in the world. Which for anyone who has heard anything about the trade, they would go, yeah, of course, this is the one that everyone hears of. Back in the 1980s, America, and from that I mean the United States of America, was effectively a wide open market for drug cartels, and demand was high in this time. Colombian and Peruvian cartels would take advantage and supply the country with this substance that would fuel, quote, the decade of excess. Which, for anyone who remembers the overtop nature of the 80s, yeah, it kinda was. And so this is where things would remain for a while. Ecuador doesn't really come into the picture until the US-led war on drugs. That is something that would in turn make life hell for cartels in other countries, and Ecuador would then become the new hot destination for narco gangs. Remember, in the 1980s and 90s, Colombia was the center of the international illegal drug trade. And this is hardly surprising considering that it was the top producer of cocoa leaves. Coca leaves, not cocoa. We're not talking about chocolate, but this is definitely a type of powdered sugar. But everyone, before we get back to the episode, I would just like to thank every single person that has signed up already to go on trips with me, both to Peru and also to the German Christmas markets. Right now, as it stands, there are only a couple spots left for the early bird spots for our Germany trip, the trip that we're going to be taking to go to the Christmas markets. We're going to be going to the Schönbrunn Palace. We're going to be going to the Hohensalzburg Fortress. We're going to be going to a variety of different things. It's going to be this perfect blend of both a shopping trip and yet also simultaneously a cultural and historical experience. Still, I know that a number of people were saying that the trip is more expensive, which is something that happens when we go to Europe. So if you want something that is more affordable and outdoorsy, we are actually going to Peru here in July, which is significantly lower in price. But also again, since that trip is happening in July versus November, that means the deadline to book that trip is like next month. But even then, the trips only require that you put 25% down, and in the case of something like the German Christmas market, there are monthly payment plans until the actual final payment is due. The final payment for the people who are currently signed up for the Peru trip is literally this next week, so that is something that you need to get on fast if you want to. I cannot wait to go on an adventure with all of you, so by all means go ahead and click the links down in my description, and I can't wait to see you all here in the future. Anyway, in response, beginning in 2000, a joint initiative between Colombian authorities and the US, known as Plan Colombia, would go and pump billions of dollars into an effort to try and clamp down on the trade. And from that, the program would actually seem to work. It would show results after the first few years. But this is also where we need to discuss FARC, which, no, I'm not saying that is anything inappropriate. This is FARC, an entity that would have a huge influence on the shape of events that would lead up to Ecuador's current situation. Getting into the detail of this acronym, the Fuerzas Armadas Revolucionarias de Colombia, the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, this is FARC, a Marxist guerrilla organization that was formed back in 1964 and was pretty brutal. Known to most of the world as simply just FARC, which that's how I'm going to refer to this as now on. The organization was initially formed in 1964 as the military wing of the Colombian Communist Party back in the 60s, where everything was swinging, including guns around the hips of pretty much every person you can imagine in Latin America. FARC is the largest of Colombia's rebel groups, estimated to possess some 10,000 armed soldiers and thousands of supporters, which are largely drawn from Colombia's rural areas. They support a redistribution of wealth from the wealthy to the poor, and from that oppose the influence that multinational corporations and foreign governments, particularly when talking about this, the United States, would have potentially on Colombia itself. Now, we're not going to get into the exact nitty-gritties of all of this, but it is something that is definitely brutal when talking about any kind of guerrilla organization. FARC has carried out bombings, assassinations, hijackings, and other armed attacks against various different political and economic targets in the country. They've also kidnapped foreigners for ransom, executing many of their captives. As for how they were able to do any of this in the first place, well, FARC's link to drug trafficking would bring in hundreds of millions of dollars annually into the organization, and also from the taxes that it would impose upon the people and businesses and everything from the territory that it would control. This is a lot of money for a rebel group in Latin America to be able to have. And from that, they would receive some external support for their activities from paramilitary organizations and sympathetic governments, such as that of the Cuban government with Fidel Castro. Now, my friends, as I said before, it would take way too long to discuss the very dark and sordid history of FARC's attempts to become a legitimate political party for us to include in this video, because that is a whole other thing. But if you would like us to do a video on that particular subject and the organization in a future video, then go ahead and type Colombia's Finest down in the comments below, and if we get enough response of that, well, we'll gauge the interest and see if people really want to see it. It is a giant mess. Spoiler alert, needless to say, it involved a lot of failed attempts and enough decades of political violence to rival the time of troubles in Ireland, just for the sheer amount of chaos that we're talking about. Meanwhile, the Colombian government was fighting a protracted and brutal war against these guerrilla groups, and everything goes to crap. But then suddenly, after decades upon decades of conflict, what would seem like a miracle would occur in 2016. Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos would surprise many by pushing to negotiate a bilateral ceasefire with FARC in order to discuss their disarmament and also conversion to a formal political party. Now, this would take around a year or so to fully hash out, but soon, FARC soldiers were meeting at predetermined amnesty points to turn in their weapons in front of UN observers, and the FARC political party was then guaranteed 10 unelected seats in the Colombian legislature, 5 being in the House of Representatives and 5 being in the Senate, which was huge considering that they never had the opportunity at that point to even be voted into that power in the first place. Now, at this point, a number of people may be wondering, okay, well, why am I talking about this? Well, think about it for a second. Remember that one of the largest components of how FARC made money was through the illegal drug trade. And so now the largest name, or at least one of the largest names in the international trade of that powdery substance, is suddenly on the straight and narrow. They're wearing suits instead of combat fatigues. Suddenly, there is a power vacuum in the drug trade, specifically in the area of where it is being produced and distributed. It is in this case that Mexico's cartels go and make the first moves. Over the past decade, there has been a massive growth in these cartels, led by the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco New Generation cartel. In fact, a study last year would find that Mexican cartels were the country's 5th largest employer. I want you to think about that here for a second. With a country that has 127 million people living in it, the 5th largest employer in the entirety of Mexico are illegal cartels. That is another insane story that we could do right there. Anyway, these cartels come to dominate the illegal drug trade in Latin America, not just for, the powdery substance, but also the trafficking of heroin, and also, much more lately, fentanyl. Anyone who has even a remote semblance of a survival instinct knows that you don't get in the way of the Mexican cartels doing business. And so, even though it had been the dominant power for decades, Colombian drug trade to the US slowed down drastically as the cartels from Mexico were now in control of everything that was coming out of Colombia. But, that being said, they didn't necessarily really care about who was going to be dealing with Europe. The big trade that they cared about was the United States. This, in turn, created another kind of vacuum. And so local gangs would reach out to other parts of the world, and they realized that the market in Europe for their high-quality nose candy, well, that was something that was also rich with opportunity. And so gangs from Peru and Colombia would begin to move into Ecuador, taking advantage of the lack of a strong existing anti-smuggling operation structure that would exist in that country in comparison to their own home countries. As an example of this, in 2009, former President Rafael Correa would close down the U.S. airbase in Manta, this being from where American AWAC surveillance planes had been monitoring and trying to disrupt drug trafficking in the region, which, as you can imagine, meant that the whole thing ended up being way more open to them than previously had been. These Peruvian and Colombian criminal elements were then joined by Brazilian and European gangs, notably from Albania, which again is probably a whole other story in and of itself that would need to be talked about, who began to show up in Ecuador. The impact locally of these outside gangs has been disastrous for Ecuador in turn. European and Mexican organizations ran local operatives as enforcers and transporters in the old days, but now these are the people who have become the backbone of Ecuador's current gang problem. These are the individuals who know the local police and government. They are also the ones who know the local smuggling routes and also who they need to bribe. And so when the foreign gangs come in with manpower and resources to secure the transportation of their product, these local operatives essentially became the rulers of their own fledgling little cartels. This is where things really start to get out of hand. The profits from shipping their illegal product to Europe were estimated to be around 3 to 4 times what they would be to ship to the United States, considering that there was significantly less competition that could potentially undercut them. And so Ecuadorian gang leaders and drug lords were only too happy to continue staying out of the Mexican cartel's way and instead focusing on European trade. And once they found this untapped market, they quickly got to work. Ecuadorian gangs such as Los Chineros would develop as de facto subsidiaries of Sinaloa and other Mexican cartels. A good way to kind of compare this for anyone who's wondering how this sort of relationship would work, a good historical comparison would be that of a vassal state. So yes, these Ecuadorian gangs would have their own territory and sovereignty in that region, but they do answer to the Mexican cartels in much the same way that the leader of a vassal state would ensure that his country did not cross the superior country in the relationship. The development of this relationship would have severe consequences. For many years, Ecuador had one of the lowest homicide rates in all of Latin America, an indicator of low gang activity. And as a result of this, it didn't really need to develop a robust police and military response to gangs. That wasn't really a problem that they had. There was no squads of high-level tactical operators that were storming the favelas here. Ecuador, in comparison to Colombia, El Salvador, and other countries, was kind of seen as having a soft touch to organized bosses. It was a destination spot for American tourists, and US expats have traditionally viewed it as one of the prime places to retire to. For years, it was a safe place to go to. But, regrettably, every single thing that I have described here so far, this would kind of change that relationship. The current challenges in Ecuador partly stem from efforts to address criminality. As an example, during the administration of Rafael Correa between 2012 and 2017, there was a surge in the prison population. Now, Ecuador didn't have necessarily any experience dealing with crime or gang activity of this level as was surging during this time, and so by throwing all of these prisoners into, well, prison, this had the unintended effect of prisons evolving into a focal point for criminal organizations. They would become centers for networking between criminals and would be dubbed, quote, universities of crime. There, they could host a spectrum of different illicit activities, fostering coordination among varying different criminal organizations, and really serving as a kind of recruiting ground for their activities in gangs. That's not to say that everything immediately got worse. In fact, things seemed to actually get better at first by throwing these different gang members into prison, as the more of them that went into prison, violence would decrease. But even as this would happen, things kind of got worse under the surface. The ties between criminal organizations and some state actors would grow stronger. Ironically, during Correa's administration, efforts to combat narco-politics would coincide with the rise of Los Chineros, Ecuador's leading drug trafficking gang. After the election of Correa's vice president, Lenin Moreno, to the presidency from 2017 to 2021, the previous uneasy peace between some state actors and the gangs would then seem to change. This would result in chaos in prisons and violence spilling into the streets. And the government was going to have to respond. It was under Guillermo Lasso's government between 2021 and 2023 that the state would declare a war on drugs, which in turn would lead to a surge in homicides. The shift towards a militarized approach would achieve a limited success in eradicating gang violence, and it would showcase authoritarian responses against these social protests that would denounce the reduction of social protections in the country as the state tried to get gang violence under control. Things would continue to destabilize, though. In December of 2022, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol would encounter more than 16,000 Ecuadorians at the U.S. southern border, which was, mind you, 24 times the number that had been seen that same month a year prior. Many people did not want to be in the state anymore as things were descending into chaos. And then, in August of 2023, a presidential candidate, Fernando Villavicencio, was assassinated at a campaign stop just 10 days before the next presidential election. Now, my friends, I should note here from the very beginning here that a Democratic candidate getting assassinated is never a good thing. It really is not. We obviously know this. But it should also be noted that Villavicencio wasn't just your average run-of-the-mill politician. He specifically was running on a strong anti-corruption platform and was eliminated, likely because he potentially would have done something about it. This guy, in the current state of Ecuadorian politics, was probably seen as one of the biggest threats to the status quo at the time. Villavicencio's shooting would follow the murder on July 23rd of Agustin Intriago, who was the mayor of the port city of Manta, and that of Ryder Sanchez, who was running for a seat in the National Assembly when he, in turn, was shot dead on July 17th while campaigning in the northern coastal province of Esmeraldas. It's not an isolated incident. Politicians were being taken out left and right if they didn't tote specific kinds of lines. What makes this entire thing worse is that the political situation, despite, the assassinations and everything, somehow, magically, was not stable. It was only getting more so. The August 2023 parliamentary and presidential elections that would occur were only being held as a result of the outgoing president, Guillermo Lasso, going and dissolving parliament in May of that same year. Lasso would face impeachment by opposition parties over allegations of connections to corrupt government contracts, something that he and his supporters would vehemently deny. And because Villavicencio would campaign on a pro-security and anti-corruption platform, while he was not necessarily considered a frontrunner, his assassination during this time that all of this is going in Ecuadorian politics is something that would go and shock the nation. But why? Why is all of this happening? Why is any of this going on? Well, this had a great deal to do with the success of Correa's policy while president from 2007 to 2017 of effectively legalizing gangs, for lack of a better word, as, quote, cultural associations of urban youth groups, which sounds like a very complex way to say gangs, but that's pretty much everything that's what they had to do. This would allow these gangs to apply for government funding and grants in return for a pledge to basically stop gang activities, to stop being violent. Almost a kind of way to bribe the criminal organizations to not be criminals anymore. Korea's policy would see the country's homicide rate fall sharply during that time, but as you can imagine, this would ever so likely increase the copious amounts of corruption that can be possibly present in such a system where you are literally handing violent gangs money. So it is then that in the past 7 years, the murder rate began to increase sharply again, making Ecuador from one of the safest countries in Latin America to easily one of the most violent. That in turn brings us back to Villavicencio, who already at this point had made plenty of enemies when he took up politics, having exposed multiple corruption cases during his time as a journalist. In January of 2023, while still a member of the National Assembly before its dissolution, Villavicencio had denounced 21 mayoral candidates for alleged links to drug trafficking. He would also, during this time, go and reveal that he had received death threats from the previously mentioned Los Choneros gang, which was, as I said, one of Ecuador's most powerful gangs, involved in illegal activities ranging from narco-trafficking to contract killings and extortion. So, kind of a very real threat there. But, of course, as I already mentioned, Villavicencio was assassinated, and interestingly enough, his killer was shot by security forces in the immediate aftermath of the attack. And, in addition to that, 6 further suspects were detained. All of these suspects were of Colombian origin and reportedly members of criminal groups. After decades of armed conflict, Colombia had earned a reputation for producing and exporting contract killers that could be utilized by other nations' gangs and even potentially political muscle. Remember how we talked about in previous videos the whole issue with Haiti, which we're definitely going to have to go back into again considering what has been happening in recent developments? Well, both Haiti's former president, Jovenel Moise, and Paraguayan anti-corruption prosecutor Marcelo Pecci were assassinated by Colombian mercenaries. It's not exactly a coincidence at this point. And so, my friends, out of the ashes of all of this tragedy comes the young man, Daniel Noboa, an individual who had been trending behind Villavicencio in roughly 3rd in the polls. And he is the character that is going to become vital for this story. Full name Daniel Roy Gilchrist Noboa Azin was born on the 30th of November 1987 in Miami, Florida. However, he was raised in Guayaquil. He is the son of businessman Alvaro Noboa and physician Annabella Azin. If you're Ecuadorian, you probably already know this, but Alvaro Noboa has been actively involved in Ecuadorian politics as a perennial candidate, unsuccessfully running for office of President of Ecuador in 1998, 2002, 2006, 2009, and 2013. So not exactly what we would call a track record of success, but in 2007, however, he was elected to the National Assembly. And in 2013, Noboa would run for president for a 5th time. Unsuccessfully, as I said. Alvaro Noboa was also the heir to a banana growing and shipping conglomerate, which would ensure his fortunes and allow him to attempt so many runs for office. Because, when you're kind of born into money, you don't really need to worry about these kinds of things. Presently, he runs the Noboa Group of companies and Noboa Corporation with more than 110 companies in Ecuador and also around the world, including branch offices in the United States, Switzerland, Rome, Japan, Argentina, and New Zealand. Now, I don't mean to go into all this background when talking about an individual and their wealth and power, etc., but you need to understand that this means that his son, Daniel, was given the best education and every advantage to begin a political career at a very young age. Plus, with his father's contacts, despite all the unsuccessful attempts to run for political office, it still means that he would have some contacts in the first place. So it is then, my friends, that on the 20th of August, 2023, Noboa would gather 23.47% of the actual votes and would advance to the runoff election that was set for the 15th of October, facing Luisa Gonzalez. His second place finish was seen as surprising. People didn't really expect this to actually happen, with some attributing his rise in popularity to his debate performances. Noboa, who was aged 35 at the time, would credit the young voter base of the country for his victory, and he would then proceed to obtain 52% of the votes in the runoff election, which in turn would cause him to win the total election, becoming the youngest person ever elected as president in Ecuadorian history, and from that, the youngest currently serving national leader in the world. Which, considering everything that we could possibly talk about with politicians and typically how old they are in the modern day and age, that is a very big deal. Problem though, because Noboa was elected in a snap election, upon his inauguration, that meant that he only had 18 months to govern and complete the rest of Lasso's term before it would naturally expire before the next election was scheduled in 2025. He had a lot of work to do, and fast. As he would tell his supporters in the seaside town of Olin after clinching his victory, quote, "Tomorrow we start work for this new Ecuador. We start working to rebuild a country seriously battered by violence, by corruption, and by hate." Noboa wanted to show that he was serious, and it wasn't going to be long before he would get that chance to show his country just how serious he could be. Because now we have a prison break. I mentioned this before in a previous video talking about the subject, but on the 7th of January 2024, Los Llaneros' leader, Jose Adolfo Macias Villamar, would escape from prison in the city of Guayaquil, this being on the day of his scheduled transfer to a maximum security prison. The events that would happen were reported the next day by authorities, with charges then being filed against 2 prison guards. Following the escape, Noboa would go and declare a state of emergency, something that was to last for 60 days, giving authorities the power to suspend people's rights and allowing the military to be mobilized inside of prisons. What would result from this is a series of riots. As riots would break out in the prisons all across Ecuador, 2 days later, mass armed attacks would occur throughout the country, including armed groups storming a television broadcasting station mid-air. This is where we got this absolutely insane scene where Los Llaneros gang members were putting a stick of dynamite in a reporter's pocket and another made him hold a grenade in the air. At the same time that this would happen, 3 drones would drop their explosive payloads on the roof of a prison facility in Guayaquil. According to a tweet that was posted by Ecuador's Penitentiary Administration, the strike would hit the regional Guayas 4 Rehabilitation Center next to the main prison that was holding most inmates. Included among those prisoners are members and leaders of gangs that are affiliated with rival international drug cartels, particularly those in Mexico, which I spoke about earlier, which may now, from all of this, be seen as using drones to strike at one another. Reports as of now indicate that there have been at least 8 cases of drones dropping contraband, usually drugs, into Ecuadorian prisons this year alone. Just last June, a UAV would crash while conducting a flight over the same Guayaquil prison that was attacked in January, which is a high security facility that, has no anti-drone protections in place. That is not something that until now has ever really been a thing. Both Chile and Colombia have also now reported aerial deliveries of banned material into their jails, with similar activity underway and growing in the US, in Canada, and Europe. It is something that is on the rise. And so this, naturally, from everything that I've talked about, is insane. But explaining how Ecuador became the epicenter of drug gang violence is one thing. Trying to then find a way out of this for the country, that's a whole other issue entirely. We talked about it before on this channel, but across Latin America, countries have employed different types of models to counter organized crime, with varying degrees of successes. Colombia, with extensive US assistance, would transform its military and police, and went to war with the cartels. This strategy somewhat successfully dismantled organized crime groups in the country, but that didn't really do anything to stop drug trafficking itself or lower the high amount of deaths that would occur within the country. Mexican authorities have tried a different approach and have been reluctant to confront the country's drug cartels head-on. Instead, Mexico has employed a more hands-off approach, allowing drug gangs to essentially govern some of their states, with the state of Sinaloa being effectively run largely by the cartel that shares its name. Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has even touted his hugs, not bullets approach, but under it, the power of the cartels has only grown. And then, of course, as we mentioned in a previous video, there's the Salvadoran model. For many years, El Salvador, like a lot of its neighbors, would suffer from organized crime, with the MS-13 gang behind much of the country's violence. But then, in 2019, the electorate would vote in the young Nayib Bukele on a law and order platform. And since then, he effectively militarized the country, adopted absolutely draconian security measures, and jailed around 100,000 alleged gang members, often without due process. But hey, it worked. As a result, El Salvador is now perceived as one of the safest places in Latin America. You can safely walk down the street or run a business without being extorted and having your life threatened weekly by gangs. This has been achieved, of course, though, at the expense of human rights. Unlike what we talked about with earlier methods that were done by Ecuador, Bukele's methods, though even more harsh, have had enormous popular appeal, and his people, seemingly, have continued to give him a mandate to continue his rule. The reason that I mention that is that with an unprecedented wave of violence in Ecuador, it looks like the president, Noboa, is looking to take his country down that same path as El Salvador. He has ordered the Ecuadorian military to neutralize the criminal gangs that operate in the country. Now, whether this approach will work is another matter entirely. Ecuador has a significantly weaker position than El Salvador, and Bukele also had control of all three branches of the Salvadoran government, meaning that Noboa isn't just going to be able to do this as he wants. He has to do more compromising with members of other parties in order to make any kind of real sweeping changes. Something that may be an issue considering the ties over the years that have developed between illicit criminal organizations and politicians. And when we were talking about this and the illicit relationship with criminal gangs, whereas many of the gangs were imported into El Salvador, with many members of MS-13 having been deported from the US, in Ecuador, they are homegrown and have become significantly more sophisticated. Furthermore, Noboa, despite taking office in December, has only 12 months left, considering that I'm making this now in May, of his presidency before another general election takes place in May of 2025. And in politics, that is not a lot of time. Yet, that being said, considering what we were talking about here with Bukele's methods, that might actually be seen as an election winner. He might actually get the mandate that he desires. Like in El Salvador, the majority of Ecuador's citizens appear ready for an iron fist, or a mano duro. This harsh approach to counter the gangs, even at the expense of some civil liberties, are seen by many as necessary. If you speak to the average Ecuadorian, many would no doubt tell you that the talk of human rights violations is ridiculous at a time when they live under the fear of being murdered simply by leaving their homes. Like, imagine this, that you are an Ecuadorian. You've grown up in what has been seen as effectively a paradise for many years, and everything was great. But over the course of less than a decade, your homeland was turned upside down into something that you do not recognize by crime, greed, and gang violence. When you look at things that way, it's not hard to realize that many people are struggling to get very basic necessities compared to what most in the Northern Hemisphere have to deal with. The people here oftentimes have less time to worry about individual freedoms, social liberties, and civil rights, and more so to worry about blood being spilled. As one man would tell the Associated Press in the aftermath of January 9th's violence, the government needs to employ, quote, a firmer hand to have no mercy, no tolerance, or respect for the human rights of criminals. And from that, in declaring an internal armed conflict, President Noboa's strategy echoes the approach that was taken by El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele. This approach itself mirrors the experiences of Colombia's attempts to combat violence by using the figure of a state of emergency. The declaration of an internal war, of aligning with the population's desperate need for immediate solutions to tackle insecurity, all of this gives more authority to military forces. But the problem is, it lacks a strategy beyond the promise to defeat armed groups. It doesn't actually mean that it's going to fix the inherent issues. Also compounding the worries of some, the militarization of public security can lead to an escalation in violence, as criminal groups will likely in turn respond to this violence with their own, in a gradually kind of escalating conflict. This escalation can lead to a cycle of violence and repression in which civilians will inevitably end up in the crossfire of multiple armed factors. But okay, what happens? In the aftermath of the January 9th violence, Noboa would go and name 22 gangs as terrorist organizations, a designation that makes them legitimate military targets. He then imposes a 60-day state of emergency, during which Ecuadorians are subject to curfews, while the armed forces would try and restore public order in the streets and the country's gang-controlled prisons. And as time would go on and the issue would still not be resolved, another state of emergency would then be issued, this one being supposedly to protect the energy infrastructure of the country. But how? How is all of this happening? Well, speaking of recent events in Ecuador, we now get to the portion of the video where we talk about what caused this video right now to be made in the first place. On April 5th, 2024, Ecuadorian Special Force operators would breach entry into the Mexican embassy in Quito. Their mission was to apprehend and detain Jorge Glas, Ecuador's former vice president. Glas had served in several ministerial roles under the longtime left-wing government of former Ecuadorian president Rafael Correa. He held the position as Correa's vice president from 2013 to 2017, and Honestly, when we're talking about this guy, he was dirtier than a porta potty in a rock festival. The man was corrupt. Glass had been convicted on charges of bribery and corruption and remains under investigation for other potential crimes. In 2017, he was forced out of office and was sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of receiving over $13.5 million in bribes. In 2020, a separate bribery case would lead to Glass being found guilty of accepting money in exchange for issuing public contracts between 2012 and 2016. Which, for anyone who has seen any of the things that we have talked about in terms of corruption on this channel, whether it be Malaysia, South Africa, or others, corruption in contracts is one of the both easiest and simultaneously one of the most lucrative things that a politician could possibly do. The case was naturally very closely watched. But not only because of the involvement of Glass. Among those eventually convicted of accepting some $8 million in bribes was Rafael Correa himself, the country's magnetic but very divisive former president. That's right, we are getting up here in terms of political corruption. Both Mr. Correa and Mr. Glass were sentenced to 8 years in prison, a conviction that Mr. Correa has claimed was politically motivated. At the time of the embassy breach, when all of this goes down, Glass was attempting to use the tried and true method for crooked Ecuadorian politicians to flee their country by claiming asylum in Mexico. For months, he had stayed on the Mexican embassy's grounds in Quito. And then finally, on April 5th, the Mexican government would announce that it was going to approve Glass's request for asylum. And that was when it went too far. That is when Noboa would order his forces to make their move. Mexican forces would move into the embassy, and following this attack in Quito, Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador would write in an ex-post that the incident constituted a, quote, authoritarian act and a flagrant violation of international law and sovereignty of Mexico. Foreign Minister Alicia Bárcena would say on X that Mexican diplomatic personnel would immediately leave Ecuador, and Mexico would quickly file a lawsuit against Ecuador in the International Court of Justice. For some of you that are listening to this right now, you're probably wondering, okay, well, why is this happening? Like, why is this a big deal? Why was an embassy attack such a huge thing? Well, this is a very rare occurrence in the first place. The Vienna Convention on Consular Relations is an international treaty that was signed back in 1963, something that would govern consular relations between sovereign states. It was signed following a UN conference on consular relations. It decrees that embassies are inviolable. You can't violate them, in other words. And local law enforcement agencies of host countries are not allowed to enter their premises. They can only enter with the consent of the head of the mission. To explain it in better terms, under international law, even though the embassies are located inside of other countries, embassy grounds are treated as their sovereign territories, not that of the country that is actually hosting them. So the Mexican embassy in Ecuador is not the land of Ecuador, it is directly Mexico. Any forces entering their premises would be treated as an actual invasion, a military invasion. Diplomats in many cases also have diplomatic or consular immunity, which means that they can be exempt from some of the laws of the host country and are protected from arrest or detention. However, that all being said, they can be declared persona non grata by the host country, which means that the host country is allowed to send a foreign consular staff member back to the home country that they came from if they think that they are doing anything wrong. In effect, if you'll remember that incident where the Iranian consulate in Damascus, Syria in early April was bombed, well, under international law, Israel doing that was the equivalent of attacking Iranian soil. The Ecuadorian police action in Quito likely was just the same as if the officers had entered Mexico in order to arrest someone without the Mexican government's approval. As for why that would happen in the first place, the decision that Mexico even made to offer refuge to Glass, this is something that follows a century-old tradition, or multiple centuries-old tradition, where many embassies would shelter dissidents of political asylum seekers who fear arrest, violence, or even deaths in their own home countries. And just as an example of that, here's some prominent instances from recent decades. In late March, the office of Argentina's president, Javier Milei, would announce that members of Venezuela's opposition coalition had sought refuge in the Argentinian embassy in Caracas. Another example is that former Maldives President Mohammed Nasheed would seek shelter at the Indian High Commission amidst reports of threats to his own life after a court would issue an arrest warrant. He finally left after India would end up brokering a deal for his freedom. Chinese civil rights activist Chen Guangchen would flee from house arrest in 2012, and he himself would seek asylum at the United States Embassy in Beijing. Another guy, former Afghan President Mohammed Najibullah, would seek shelter at the compound of the United Nations Special Mission to Afghanistan after he was removed by armed groups in 1992. When the Taliban took over Kabul, they went and offed him anyway in 1996 while he was still being sheltered there, but yeah, that did happen. Erich Honecker, who was the former leader of East Germany, was indicted in Germany for the deaths of East Germans who had tried to cross the Berlin Wall, and in 1991, he would seek refuge at the Chilean embassy in Moscow. There are many more cases of things like this happening, but an interesting thing to note is that despite protections under international law, what we're talking about here with Ecuador and Mexico, it's not exactly the first incident. It's definitely rare, of course, that a country, a government, would directly take action against another, as usually in the past this has been more non-state actors. And here are some examples of what it is that I mean. In September of 2023, there was an assailant that went and attacked the Cuban embassy in the US capital of Washington, D.C. with 2 Molotov cocktails. In July of 2023, protesters would storm the Swedish embassy in Baghdad over what was supposed to be the second burning of a Quran in front of the Iraqi embassy in Stockholm. Shortly after this would happen, Iraq would go and expel Sweden's ambassador. In September of 2022, a suicide bombing would take place near the entrance of the Russian embassy in Kabul. 2 of the 6 casualties ended up being employees of the embassy. In July of 2021, the Cuban embassy was attacked again, but this time in Paris, and it also was attacked with Molotovs, causing serious damage, but there were no injuries at this time. In one of the more famous incidences in 2012, the US consulate in Benghazi, Libya, that was attacked, which from that would end up killing the US ambassador, as well as 3 others at the time. More graphically though, in another example, a suicide car bombing at the Indian embassy in Kabul would kill 58 people in July of 2008, injuring more than 140 others. And on August 7th, 1998, the US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam were attacked in truck bombings that would kill more than 220 people. So, my friends, for anyone who has been listening to this, anyone who has been hearing me explain all this at the end, what I'm trying to get at here is that Noboa's decision to breach the embassy, this is not something to be taken lightly. Everything that I have listed in previous examples were by non-state actors. It hasn't really happen. This is something that doesn't happen. And why, you may wonder? Because it is a serious breach of diplomatic policy. In some instances, attacking an embassy can be seen as a direct act of war. And that is something that countries, especially in the modern day and age, typically do not do. So let me be clear here at the end. What Ecuador did by invading Mexico's embassy is directly in violation of long-standing international policies and norms. It was unequivocally an illegal act in the eyes of the world. But Noboa, when asked about it during an interview, said he would do it again if he was given the opportunity. In easily what is one of the most high-stress positions a world leader can be in, this man is standing on business to an unprecedented level. He is not giving in. The need and desire to provide what he sees as justice to his people has become such an overriding mission to Noboa that he risked losing the approval of the entire international community just to secure that approval of his people. The question is that a mistake? Well, if you ask the average Ecuadorian, they tend to agree with Noboa that it wasn't a mistake. Naturally, some citizens are going to worry about what it will mean for the country diplomatically in the long run, but most of these who have been asked seem to express support for Noboa sticking to his convictions regarding bringing those in charge of corruption to justice. As for what that spells for the future, we don't really know yet. One of the biggest ironies of this whole situation is one particular asylum seeker that we haven't really mentioned yet, Julian Assange. Assange, for those of you who are not familiar, is an Australian editor, publisher, and activist who had found a website called WikiLeaks in 2006. In 2010, U.S. Army intelligence analyst Bradley Manning would give Assange a series of government leaks, this being classified information that would expose the U.S. government in multiple ways regarding its conduct conduct in Iraq and Afghanistan. On the 19th of June 2012, the Ecuadorian Foreign Minister Ricardo Patino would announce that Assange had applied for political asylum, and that the Ecuadorian government was considering his request, and that Assange was at the Ecuadorian embassy in London. An office was converted into a studio apartment, and this in turn was equipped with a bed, telephone, sun lamp, computer, shower, treadmill, and also a kitchenette. It was in this place that Assange would be limited to roughly 30 square meters of living space, and he would eat a combination of delivered food and food that was prepared by the embassy staff. And it was here that he was going to remain. The UK government would write to Patino saying that the police were entitled to enter the embassy and arrest Assange under UK law. But Patino would say that this was an implied threat, and that, quote, such actions would be a blatant disregard of the Vienna Convention. Officers of the Metropolitan Police Services were then stationed outside of the embassy from June 2012 to October of 2015 to arrest Assange if he left the embassy and compel him to attend the extradition appeal hearing. The police officers were then withdrawn on the grounds of cost in October of 2015, but the police would say that they would still deploy several overt and covert tactics in order to arrest him. Ultimately, this whole thing, when we talk about a police effort to arrest one guy by literally just stationing there and watching it, the Metropolitan Police Service would say that the cost of policing it during this period was £12.6 million, which is a lot. On the 16th of August 2012, Patino would announce that Ecuador was granting Assange political asylum because of the threat that was represented by the United States secret investigation against him. And in its formal statement, Ecuador would say that, quote, as a consequence of Assange's determined defense to freedom of expression and freedom of press, in any given moment, a situation may come where his life, safety, or personal integrity will be in danger, end quote. Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa would confirm on August 18th that Assange could stay at the embassy indefinitely. Fast forward a little bit of time, and in March of 2017, WikiLeaks began releasing the largest leak of CIA documents in history, codenamed Vault 7. The documents would include details of the CIA's hacking capabilities and software tools that were used to break into smartphones, computers, and other internet-connected devices. This would royally piss off the US, and according to former intelligence officials, in the wake of the Vault 17 leaks, the CIA talked about kidnapping Assange from Ecuador's London embassy, and some senior officials discussed his potential assassination. Assange would go and continue to run WikiLeaks from the embassy, but over time he began to wear out his welcome as his activities began to bring more and more heat onto the Ecuadorians. Then, on the 11th of April, 2019, Ecuador revoked his asylum. He was then arrested for failing to appear in court and was carried out of the embassy by members of the London Metropolitan Police. Following his arrest, the US would reveal a previously sealed 2018 US indictment in which Assange was charged with conspiracy to commit computer intrusion related to his involvement with Chelsea Manning and WikiLeaks. Assange is currently incarcerated at HM Prison Belmarsh in London. So a number of people at this point may be wondering why it is that we have gone off track here. And there's a very key reason. I bring all of this up because if you've gotten any of the similarities so far, Ecuador gave asylum to Assange for over 7 years. Yet, they went and breached the Mexican embassy the same day that Jorge Glass was given asylum. It's almost as if they were trying their hardest to make them look like hypocrites on the world stage. But that's just how Noboa seems to be committed to stamping out all corruption and crime in his country. I say this because we first mentioned Noboa here a couple months ago when discussing El Salvador and Nayib Bukele. We mentioned how Noboa and Bukele share many similarities, and how it's very likely that Noboa will continue to follow down that same path to a benevolent dictatorship. The same kind of thing that Bukele seems to have now. But this attack on an embassy, it's different. Would Bukele have done the same? It's really hard to say for sure. But my guess is that, yeah, he probably would have done so. At the time that this video was being made, Mexico was furious and demanding an apology, while Ecuador would go and make the counterclaim in the International Court of Justice that Mexico was actually breaking international law by harboring fugitives from justice in their embassy. Legally, Mexico has an ironclad case, and Ecuador's claims just don't really have much footing to stand on. But Daniel Noboa made a very strong and decisive move, something to show not only the people of Ecuador how serious he was, but the larger world as well. Was it a gamble that was worth making? Maybe. Or has what has happened, has he just won the battle for local public opinion just to lose the war for international approval and risk everything? That is a question that remains to really be seen. One thing is for sure though, we're going to be watching his career with great interest, and we'll keep on providing updates and background and story as time goes on. Thank you all for watching. This has been Stakuyi with the History of Everything podcast YouTube channel. I appreciate all of you for watching. If you could like, comment, subscribe, and let me know in the comment section below what it is that you'd like to see next, I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you, my friends, and I will see you all next time. Goodbye, guys.